very focused on the Vietnam culture, and that shaped me, and really shaped my whole life.
I was going to say 1968, you said that was a super chaotic year. A lot happened in that year. I would think that was very influential in shaping your ideas about policy and politics.
It still does. I mean, I think and look at the Iraq War, and I still think in terms of the Vietnam War, and the mistakes we made in the past, we don't seem to learn our lesson.
So like some people will experience those events and they'll just be frustrated about them, but then move on with their lives. What was it about these things that ultimately culminated in you wanting to basically run for office?
It's a progression, and then there's a gap, and then it gets reignited. So I mentioned going back to remembering the Bobby Kennedy Vietnam days, when Richard Nixon was being indicted or impeached. I followed avidly the Watergate hearings. I was alone with my grandparents at their country house, and they would go to play golf, and they left me and a TV that got the Watergate hearings and nothing else. So there I was as a 11-year-old attached watching them, and I was obsessed with it, and Richard Nixon was the enemy, and mainly over the Vietnam War. And I went from there to working on the Kennedy campaign in 1980, and I worked on the Gary Hart campaign in 1984. And then I got into the sports bar and did that, and probably got less politically involved until my son Logan got involved in the Clinton campaign in 2016. And through his experiences, I got much more ignited in politics than I had been in a long time. In June of 16, Logan and I were at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, and I was struck by the similarities between what happened in Germany and when rights get taken away from people, and what was going on, at least at Trump rallies, and fearing that something like that could happen here. And I told everyone who would listen to me, if Donald Trump won, I was moving. And it was easy to say because I never thought Donald Trump would win. But when he did win, I said, I'm not moving, I've got to fight back. And I have the means to do that, and I certainly have the motivation. And that really got me going. The Saturday after the election, I went to a rally with my wife outside of Trump Tower, and I hadn't rallied since the No Nukes rally in the 80s. And I just reignited my political passion and the resolve to make a difference. And then from there, I went to the Women's March and spoke to my partner in business and said, Mark, I'm going to need to step up and do something. Time to phase me out of Lone Corps, and I'm going to do something politically active. And he doesn't share my political point of views, but he looked at me and said, well, you're 55 or 54 at the time. This is your chance. You might as well take it. And so that led me to say, why not run against Zeldin, where I really thought I could make a difference.
Did you think about other races, or did you know it was Zeldin?
I knew it was Zeldin, so I wasn't going to run for president. I couldn't run for president. There was no election. I had to do something against Trump, and we've had our house in East Hampton for 20 years and have spent 50% of our time there, and had been planning to spend more time when the boys were both in college. And Marshall went to college. He's a freshman this year. So it was part of the plan to spend time here, and I knew Zeldin and really disliked Zeldin. So he seemed like the perfect guy. But what really brought it all together, I was at a fundraiser for Kirsten Gillibrand in New York City, and she looked at the crowd and said, many of you have second homes. Someone asked her, what can we do for the resistance? And she looked at the crowd and said, many of you have second homes. If there's a Republican representative, why not run for office? Go challenge them, do your civic duty. And I looked at Lisa and said, that's what I should do. And I just, from that day on, I was all in for how to run against Zeldin.
So where do you go from there? How did you put your team together? How did you start your fundraising? How did you build to where you are now?
So, there was a Sunday at the Gillibrand event. On Monday, I spent the day making phone calls to people who I thought might have some political connections. What do you do? And through my brother-in-law, I was introduced to Tim Bishop, and I made an appointment to meet with him. We had breakfast together, and Tim had me put together a resume, and he looked at it and he said, you know, you could really run a good campaign. You have, speaking to me, you have the connections to go out and raise a lot of money, which is what a Democrat is going to need to do in this election to run against Zeldin. And he said, go raise $500,000 in the first quarter, and if you do that, you will be competitive and people will take you very seriously.
That's what you did.
And that's what I did. I also met with Steve Israel in June and got the identical message from him.
So it's funny because you're kind of known as the finance guy. You must know that by now. Tell me what type of donations are you receiving, and what is your average donation?
So I've been getting donations. So just to back it up, we raised as of the end of December $1 million. 600,000 of that was from third parties, and 400,000 was contributed by me as a loan to the campaign. So the 600,000 came from individual people who've known me, family, friends, and people I've done business with directly or indirectly, lawyers and finance people predominantly, nationwide, because my business was nationwide. And the average size probably between $500 and $750. So many of them, I've spent my days during the summer and the fall just calling people who knew me and sending emails. And it was a lot of fun at first because I'm connecting with people who I hadn't talked to in a while, and they believed in me. They didn't even necessarily believe in my politics, but they believed in my integrity because they had worked with me. And I was known as a smart guy, a creative guy, an honest guy, and a guy who could bring parties together. And if you think about how Donald Trump got elected, people got dissatisfied with their elected representatives. Donald Trump ran against the system. So my pitch to donors is, I'm a high integrity guy who's truly is doing what Trump pretended to do, walking away from his job and running for good government and to try to have good people in office. And that's an appealing message to people.
No, I think you're definitely right about that. I think people wanted a political outsider. I talked to so many people who didn't know if they were going to vote for Trump or for Bernie Sanders. You know, they didn't know who they were supporting, but it's because they wanted somebody who was completely removed, which you were. So who's approaching you with support? Are people coming to you now without you coming to them and saying, you're our guy?
We're getting a lot of that. Different ways. We launched a pretty strong social media campaign starting in the summer and built an email list and have been emailing 3 or 4 times a week to people on the list with a political message, and it's usually attacking Lee Zeldin and exposing elements of Lee Zeldin's policy and pitching we can make a difference, we need to make a difference. And that's generated a lot of enthusiasm in the campaign. And then I've been meeting with people. I spent the summer, a good chunk of the summer and fall in Brookhaven, knocking on doors for the local candidates, canvassing. And people appreciated that, and people saw my name out there. So I've just made inroads in the community that way. I've done a lot of driving throughout the district. I kind of joke about, I bought a Chevrolet Volt for the campaign, and I put almost 14,000 miles on it.
Wow.
So I've been getting around, knocking on doors, going to meetings. I've been an introvert most of my life, and I'm learning not to be on the job training.
What you said was a perfect segue into my next question, which is that you've been very aggressive about calling out Zeldin's actions and saying, positioning yourself, saying this is where I stand, this is where he stands. Why do you think that that's important at this stage in the primary for you?
One of the things that I've heard when I talk to Democrats is they want to know how you're going to win. In some elections, people focus on who's the candidate they most identify with politically. But in this election, I think the driving force is going to be, at least for many, who can beat Lee Zeldin. And the best way to prove that is to identify a path and convince people. So the more I can show this is where Zeldin stands, concealed carry reciprocity, and we can decide what to get into, but he's so far right-wing on guns. He's to the right of Peter King, and he's to the right of law enforcement. So it opens up a big venue to go after him. And the more I can point those things out, hopefully it puts Perry Gershon in good name association with voters. But even if it doesn't, it gives a path for any Democrat to follow. And more than anything else in this race, I want to be positive, because I got into this to make a difference and to get Lee Zeldin out of office and to put a check on President Trump. And if that leads to some other Democrat emerging as the strongest one, I still did a good thing.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like opposition research in terms of your Democratic primary opponents is really not part of your campaign strategy.
It's not part of what I'm doing. What I'm doing is present positive things on Perry and save all of the negativity for Zeldin. But to prove to people that I can fight. I don't want to. We need a fighter to run. If you're going to go after Zeldin, you have to be able to punch. And I don't want to prove it by punching Democrats. That's the wrong way. We saw that in the last election.
Do you think that if you didn't emerge from the primary as the victor, would you commit to putting all of your finance raising support behind whoever it is and knock on doors for them and really get behind that candidate?
Absolutely. I've said this at other forums too. I can't take all my money and give it to the next candidate, because the election law doesn't allow that. But I can certainly take my time and energy. And I wouldn't want to impose myself on that candidate. I'd want them to tell me what they want. But I've walked away from my job, and I intend to see that through Election Day, whether I win the primary or not.
You said that you've been driving around and knocking on doors, and I've noticed that. You've been at every rally that I've been to. I've seen you at caucuses, at different fundraisers. And I'm wondering, what have you learned from doing that? What are people in the district telling you?
I'm learning that there's a ton of anti-Lee Zeldin energy, number one. And Democrats are energized this time around. I had an interview this morning with the East Hampton newspaper, and they opened by saying, how many forums have you done so far? And I think it's double digits now. And they said, well, how isn't it monotonous to go do the same thing all the time? And I said, no, they're all full rooms. And there are a couple of empty seats here, but I'm hopefully they'll fill up. They're generally different faces, and most of the faces here are new, or maybe they've been at one forum before, but it's not the same people going to each and every forum. So the energy is there, and the numbers, these are activist people. There are a lot more people who vote than who go to see candidate forums. And we're still early. The primary's not until June, and it's February and was January, and people are coming out to see the candidates. So that energy is there. The other thing I've seen, and it's listening to all of the candidates, the messaging, there are differences between us, but for the most part, we're all on a similar progressive message. There isn't a whole lot of issue debate. I feel this way, and someone else feels the other way, black and white. It's at best shades of gray, and shades of a similar gray.
I think that was really evident on Monday night at the East End Dem Women's Forum with you guys. There was a lot of yes and no questions, and it was just either yes across the board or no across the board.
It was a weird forum because the moderator before the forum took us aside and said she gave us a debate option. So if we were unhappy with one of the candidates' responses, we could challenge it and start a debate.
But
And
not once.
there was just,
Nothing to
there's nothing to debate.
It was actually pretty cute.
Yeah.
You know? Just to piggyback on that last question, the district is pretty diverse, and I'm wondering how you'll galvanize people if you're elected in November.
So, in general, and I've talked to Tim Bishop about this a lot, and he says it publicly. The way he won was to rely on strong turnout from the South Fork and from northern Brookhaven. And those are the Democratic strongholds. And that would be offset by the North Fork and Smithtown and southern Brookhaven. So, and if you looked at it, Brookhaven itself tended to mimic the end result of every election going back to 2002. If the Democrat won by 8%, Brookhaven had an 8% difference. If the Democrat won by 2%, Brookhaven had a 2% difference. So that's really where the election is fought. But there's such differences between the Stony Brook area, which is very concentrated Democratic, and other areas of Brookhaven, that some are very, very Republican pockets, and some of them are mixed. So my hope as a candidate, if I'm the nominee, is to do well in that middle area of Brookhaven, that independent, moderate, maybe moderate Republican leaning, but will vote Democratic and has in the past. But also, I think there's a lot of Democratic potential in Smithtown. And I've said this before, we don't have polling yet because it's early, but all of the national polling and observations that I hear say that college-educated Republicans are the ones who are turning on Donald Trump. He does well with non-college Republicans, but not well with college Republicans. Well, Smithtown is a very high percentage of college Republicans, and they also have high property taxes. And the tax law that the Republicans passed is going to impact Smithtown more as an area more than anywhere else in this district. And that should work against the Republicans, and certainly against Zeldin and the right wing of the Republicans. And for a candidate like me, and we can talk about my positive messaging, I hope, but my business background and ability to create jobs, I think will have an appeal to the college Republican who's potentially going to become a Democratic voter. So that's really my path.
Yeah, there's so much in there to unpack, and we will. But let's talk about relatability first, because while we're talking about voters, I think that there's been some confusion as to where you and your family reside. I think it was the Southampton Press said that you were a resident of East Hampton. Just confirm to everybody, is that your home? Is that your second home? Did your kids go to school out here? Where have you voted in the last 3 elections?
So, my wife and I were married in East Hampton in 1995. My wife's family had a house in East Hampton, actually 2 houses in East Hampton from the 1970s onward. And we met in '93, and she had me spending time out here.
Where were you?
All in the Northwest Woods of East Hampton.
Meaning, like, you were coming to the Northwest Woods from
New York City.
Oh, from New York City.
I grew up in New York City.
Right.
Sorry. So we would come here for weekends starting in '94, and fell in love with the area and decided we would get married here. Mm-hmm. And that led to us buying a piece of land and building a home. And as we raised our family, we split our time between New York City and East Hampton. And I worked in Greenwich. So it was a mix of where I was. But my children had roots in both places. They went to school in the Bronx. We lived in Manhattan. I worked in Greenwich, and we spent weekends in the summer in East Hampton. That morphed as my children got older. It was actually unfortunate when they were in high school. We spent less time in East Hampton than we liked. And Lisa, my wife, will be here shortly, rides horses. So she came out frequently without the rest of us. And because we had to be home with the boys for weekends. And we said when they were both in college, we were gonna finally start spending large amounts of our time out here. We're both able to work largely on our my real estate business or law business over the internet. So there was no reason why, other than the boys, why we couldn't be spending significant chunks of time in East Hampton. And then when I decided to run for office, I said, okay, I'm gonna move here full-time, which I've done. And our house was built as a full-time house anyway. And this is where I live. Our voter registration was changed in either late May or early June, both of us and our boys. And this is where we voted this year, and this is where we're gonna vote going forward.
I ask because, people concern themselves with those things, and relatability, especially out here, I just think is huge. My neighbors are vets, tradesmen, laborers, their families have been here for generations, their kids went to the same schools that they did. As a candidate looking for their support, how do you plan to connect with them and maybe overcome some of these perceived issues?
And my message is about, and we still haven't gotten to that, but my base message is really about three things. I won't go into detail, hopefully you'll ask me more questions about it. But about jobs, about the environment, and about healthcare. And what I want to do in this race and in the campaign is to talk about those issues and how a congressman in serving CD1 can make people's lives better. As long as people focus on that, my background, or where I come from, shouldn't be important. It's what can your congressman do for you, as opposed to where your congressman is from. I hope that drives the people's voting decisions. It's one thing to vote for someone who seems like you are, and maybe some people will want to do that, but I think it's more important to say, well, who's going to make my life better? And one of the things that I've started to say as I speak as a talking point, because I think it's an important one, the American dream is for people's children to have better lives than their parents. And somehow that seems to have gotten lost in the shuffle. Donald Trump capitalized on that, and I think all of us as Democrats need to realize that that's the message people want to hear. It's how can we, as parents, make our lives better for our children? And if we improve the wages that people can make in their jobs here, that will go a long way. One of the big issues in Brookhaven especially, but throughout, is when people raise their children, and if they're fortunate and they go to college and want to move up in the world, they move away because we don't have good jobs here when people graduate. And even for people who go to trade schools or don't pick the college route, the job options aren't great like they used to be since Drummond left. So we need to address that, and that's what I think this campaign is supposed to be about.
Yeah, let's talk about the issues. I think you hit the nail on the head before when you said that there's really the issues amongst the candidates, and you tend to be standing on the same side of the fence, but to me what's differentiated people was the way that they get to implementing solutions to those issues, their ideas, and then the implementation of those ideas. So I've heard you speak a lot about creating high quality, high paying jobs on Long Island through private-public partnerships to redevelop the economy. Tell us what that would look like, and specifically how you would facilitate that undertaking as our congressman.
So the different parts of that. So let's try to break it down. The first thing I'd be focused on is infrastructure, because there's a lot of sentiment in the country for a big infrastructure program. And Trump ran on it, but he's not proposing it. What he proposed was nothing. But there really is a need for a $2 trillion national infrastructure investment. And a lot of that will go into Suffolk County. And the things that we can do with a large infrastructure investment are both short-term and long-term. In short-term, it just puts people to work. If we're fixing our bridges and roads and tunnels and just any kind of improvement, sewers, any of that is putting people to work here and not abroad, and in reasonably paying jobs, and they will be union jobs. So that's a great start. But what the work produces is going to be a more competitive economy. So the three going back, Grumman left here. Grumman and aerospace was our big employer. We haven't been able to build new businesses to replace them. And the major reason for that is costs of doing business are so high. It's part of why Grumman left. Housing drives the costs up, energy drives the costs up, and transportation. Those are really, besides labor, those are the three drivers. Infrastructure improvement should improve both transportation and energy. If we put infrastructure dollars into building a tunnel between either New Jersey and Long Island or Connecticut and Long Island, that will reduce the transportation costs going forward, and that will have a major impact on bringing employers to the area. If we put infrastructure dollars into green energy and renewable technologies, say we start not only developing solar, but building solar panels and wind turbines here, or battery technology, that will drive down energy costs as well. The fact that we're on an island makes it hard to bring resources here. So anything we can do to lower that cost will make us more competitive business-wise.
You have a lot of great ideas for infrastructure. The tunnel, making the Long Island Railroad an electric system, putting side-by-side railroads together to create more trains. It's like the stuff of my daydreams. But how would you secure funding to bring those projects to our area? I mean, it's not just the state government. We need federal dollars to do it. So how?
I mean, that's part of where public-private or just state, not so much private, but state, local, county, federal government all coming together. If we all cooperate and work together, we can come up with creative places that federal money can be spent. Some of it's going to be compromise in the government. I'll agree to support someone's project somewhere else, and they'll agree to support a project on Long Island. There's a lot of money that needs to be spent, and Long Island is a neglected area. One of the things that I focused on is a program is targeting federal money for areas that have lost their major employer. So that appeals to Long Island, it appeals to the Middle West, coal, steel towns. It can really, it's a talking point, but it brings compromise with other regions of the country to actually get something done. One of the things that's made all this more complicated is the tax plan that was just passed at the end of last year. And we clearly are going to need to revamp that. The money that was given away to corporations is going to have to get recycled to other purposes, or the federal government's not going to be able to do anything.
I have so many questions about everything that you're saying.
Sorry.
It's okay. Let's talk about the tax plan. We know that it's going to hit middle-class Long Islanders. What can we do to mitigate the damage, in your opinion?
Vote out the Republicans. Seriously, that's the best thing we can do. Hopefully New York State will pass some kind of law that will make it easier to deduct state and local tax payments, whether that's making property tax somehow turn into a charitable cause. There are a bunch of different plans that different states are talking about. Another possibility is still out there that New York may sue the federal government to try to stop some of what they're doing. There's still not complete clarity on the tax package that was passed, because there's so many, it was put together so fast, there's so many contradictions within it, that it's going to need to come back to Congress. The Times had an article about that over the last week. I think it was last weekend, but things happen so fast these days that
So
it's
true.
hard to keep track. so just coming up with ways to tinker with it to improve deductibility is another. But really, we need to change it. And what this tax law did was shift money from the middle class to the wealthy. And you can break it down any way you want. Everyone got a tax cut, but the bulk of the tax cut went to the wealthiest people in America. And that makes our society that much, it increases the income inequality in our society.
Absolutely.
And we have to take affirmative steps to reverse that, or else we're just going to get worse. What can we do? Vote our people out of office and vote new people in who are going to change it. And I don't think we're going to revolt or refuse to pay our taxes, but those seem like the only choices.
You mentioned trade programs before, and I think it's definitely a key element of the discussion. I kind of feel like we've already missed the starting gun on getting training programs out to the general public. What programs would you propose that would be a good fit for Long Islanders, and what jobs would be willing to hire these people once they're out of those training programs?
So it all has to be done together. If you just do a training program and don't create jobs, then you haven't done anything.
Right.
If you're investing money in infrastructure, then you've got construction workers and you can train people for that. If you're going to invest money in clean energy technology, then you're going to create a need for workers to build things. But another step I didn't get into, if you're going to go the clean energy route or develop Long Island route, a lot of the development's going to come out of Stony Brook and the university centers. That's where a lot of the new technology ideas come from. So the more money we fund the universities into the university research, the more developments we're going to get. And then, so just again, to take a step back, my overall plan is fund more research,
Mm-hmm.
improve the business conditions so that employers want to stay here, and then take the developments that come out of the research and do at least the initial manufacturing locally. So if you can manufacture advanced solar panels on Long Island, it may cost a little bit more to do that, but you're near the developer of the fancy solar panel. So there's reason to pay a little bit more for that communication and that feedback loop. And then once it's more developed, the manufacturing of that device will probably go somewhere else where the labor cost is less.
Right.
But you can do initial manufacturing of products here locally. And there's a lot of worker demand. We have an educated workforce. We just need to create more jobs here.
Jobs for them. Let's talk more about the convergence of climate change and the economy. So sometimes I think disasters open doors to opportunity, and I'm wondering what, if any, opportunity do you see in the wake of our changing environment?
Well, again, there's demand for change. So you've got before I go to climate change, you've got water issues. So there's demand for water products, whether that be sewer or clean septic. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of research that goes on at Stony Brook for septic treatment. And we're at a level now that a lot of the East End communities are requiring. Southampton, I think, requires new houses to have clean septic put in. And East Hampton, in certain areas, is encouraging people through tax incentives and whatever to put clean septic in. But that technology is getting better every year. So there's all kinds of development potential for more of that. And that is feeding jobs here. The more development, the better the products that come in, the more demand from it. And that's coming from the pollution. Mm-hmm. So then in terms of climate change, the big issue is global warming and the rising coastlines. So what can you do about that?
At ground zero.
At ground zero. So what can you do about that? You can reduce our dependence on fossil fuels. How do you do that? You encourage solar, you encourage wind, you look at the wind project that's going on outside of Montauk. That's a huge plus if we can get that done, and it looks like it will get done. And that should decrease our need for carbon-based technology here. We can give people incentives to put solar panels on their roof. I'm doing it now. The more we do to encourage people to do that, again, the more demand there is for solar, the easier it is to sell research dollars into Stony Brook on solar, and then you'll get better solar. It all becomes a positive feedback loop. If there's demand for the product, then people will build better ones. And if we build an economy that relies or that it partially relies on green energy, more development will come here. Technologies like to cluster together. So if we are known as the green energy center, that will bring a lot of dollars and a lot of jobs in.
So let's talk more about energy. I think it was at a peer forum where you advocated for fracking and clean nuclear energy. Do you support Governor Cuomo's ban on fracking in New York State, and do you also support his closing of Indian Point in 2021?
Yes and yes. So, just to go back to what I said at Peer, I support fracking in certain rural communities like North Dakota as a short-term solution. North Dakota has built an economy on oil extraction, and it makes us more competitive. It reduces our need to import Middle Eastern oil. So while there are problems with fracking, to me the biggest problem with fracking is that it's still carbon-based. It's not clean energy. So it's not the long-term solution. But I would rather, in a rural community, extract some oil there and rather than import it from Saudi Arabia and make us dependent on them. The less dependent we are on foreign oil, the better we are. So that's really my comment on fracking. And I differentiate what oil and gas fracking. When fracking for natural gas tends to have more problems associated with it, fracking for oil is safe to a degree, although there's a byproduct that comes out of fracking, dirty water, and you can't spill it. And there have been problems with that, and it's a terrible long-term solution. And piping, if you bring oil out in North Dakota and you run pipelines from North Dakota to other areas, pipes tend to leak. And pipes also tend to be sent in areas that they shouldn't be, like the North Dakota pipeline went over tribal land, and that shouldn't have happened. Having said that, there's value there. There are people working today in North Dakota, and if you suddenly said we're going to stop fracking on January 1, 2019, you're going to put a lot of people out of work, and you're going to need to import more oil from elsewhere. So I just don't think that's a good thing. But as we develop better renewable technology, then the equation changes. In terms of nuclear, where nuclear comes in is you look at renewables and you have to separate demand and supply. We produce wind power when the wind blows. We produce solar energy when the sun is shining. But there are limits on how much we can do that. In the winter, there's less sun, and we don't have the battery technology yet to store the power. So we need something to fill those gaps for demand. And that's where nuclear can come in. It's better than carbon technology. But you have to find places that want it or that will accept it. And I certainly am not advocating nuclear in New York. But there are places, I think, and if not, then we shouldn't have it. It's just, to me, it's something to consider.
I just wonder what you would say to somebody who has, in the past 10 years seen so much go wrong because of deregulation of big companies, and when you think of something like nuclear, it's a little scary. How do you qualm those concerns?
number one, I'm very pro-regulation in general. I think it's necessary. And when it comes to nuclear, I'm doubly or 10 times pro-regulation. But the experts tell me that nuclear power has evolved to a point from where it was in the 70s to where it is today, that it's quite safe. The 3 Mile Harbor, the China syndrome, all of that would not happen with modern nuclear plants. But the older ones, it's different. Chernobyl, that's not what I'm talking about. And I'm not advocating going and developing a lot of nuclear. I'm just not for banning it, because I think it's better than carbon-based technology, carbon-based energy.
Okay, while we're on the hard-hitting questions, I'll give you another one. I saw on your website that you oppose eliminating the estate tax on wealthy Americans with estates over $5 million.
I oppose eliminating.
You oppose eliminating?
Yes.
Pardon, yeah.
So I'm for the estate tax.
You're for the estate tax, correct. It's a complex issue on Long Island because of the family farms, and people having to sell their family farms when they can't pay the estate tax to keep them in their families. Zeldin has really been vocal on this topic, in my opinion, just to further his cause of, helping millionaires and billionaires. But I want to know how you justify your position, considering Long Island farms and land preservation is so important to maintaining the integrity of the East End.
It's very easy to have an estate tax with a carve out for family farms. There's nothing that says that you can't differentiate a family farm from a millionaire's estate that he made investing in the stock market or in real estate. It's really easy to do if someone wants to do it. And at the same time, if someone doesn't want there to be an estate tax, he can cite the family farm as the reason for eliminating it. But it's the tail wagging the dog.
Right. So let's see, we talked about infrastructure, we talked about the estate tax. I was gonna tell you that I had a conversation with a neighbor about raising taxes, because I wanted to ask you how you convince somebody that it's a good idea to raise their taxes to implement some of these infrastructure things that we're talking about. And the response was, we believe it's a good thing when wealthy people spend their money, as if trickle down was the answer. Now, you and I both know that that's not really economic policy. So just maybe quickly, can you tell us, what you would say in response to that? How do you convince people that spending money to do these infrastructure projects is a good idea and to their benefit?
Infrastructure is an easy one, because people want infrastructure. People want good highways, they want good tunnels, they want good airports. They want the benefits, and infrastructure is something that, unless you're in Donald Trump land, it's supposed to be public, it's not supposed to be private. So infrastructure is the easiest government expenditure to justify, because people do want it. So that's really where I start. In terms of taxes, I am for controlling and probably cutting taxes on the middle class, the people who have the big tax burden. But there has to be a differentiation between middle class and people who can afford to pay. If you go back to, if you look at income inequality in America, it was going this way. Income inequality was getting less and less until we hit 1980. And then everything changed in 1980. Well, why did it change? The election of Ronald Reagan, and he did two things that became prevalent. He got rid of a lot of the progressiveness, which isn't a word, but the progressive levels of income tax, and he flattened the taxes. When you do that, you introduce more income inequality. The less of a burden the wealthy pay, the idea of the progressive income tax is that wealthy people who are more able to pay taxes pay more of their fair share. Mm-hmm. And Reagan changed that and started a trajectory that made income inequality much worse of a problem than it used to be. And the other thing Reagan did was he hurt unionism. He started it with the air traffic controllers, and that's had a huge effect through the years. So as a person who wants to enter government, I absolutely believe in unions and the need for unions and the need for a progressive tax system.
As a political newcomer, how are you enjoying this?
I am really liking it. I get to talk about good things that can make people's lives better, and I get to listen. And here I'm doing all the talking, but what I really like to do is listen to other people's ideas. And I'm not a dumb guy, but I have a lot to learn. And the more I hear other people's points of view, the easier it is for me to be a politician, but also for me to think of creative ways to make people's lives better.
I think that's a good segue into throwing it over to our members here and letting them ask their questions to you. So who has a question for, okay, so let's work our way across the room. We'll start with Jim.
Oh.
So, Perry, this is a two-part question. Our current president comes out of the construction industry, the building industry, and you had touched that in your life. So, could you kind of give us a sense of types of projects you've worked on, the people you interfaced with, and how that could perhaps present challenges for you, for people who are running against you, number one. And number two, because you do come from the finance community, much of the millennial population today works remotely. Is there any way you could, in terms of building jobs here on Long Island, is there any way you could encourage some of your colleagues or some fintech or some part of the financial community to use Long Island as a hub to create jobs and be an incubator for fintech?
There's a lot there. Can you repeat the first half?
The first part is about your earlier life, your career, doing financing in the construction industry. What types of projects did you work on, and could that compromise you? Could that benefit you as a candidate or compromise you?
Okay, I get it. So just what I did was to lend money on commercial real estate properties, generally office buildings and apartment houses and hotels and shopping centers. And they were generally stabilized properties, not construction. What I did in the mid-2000s, which I'm proudest of actually, is when banks were in trouble and weren't lending money, I formed, with partners, formed a non-traditional lending institution that provided money, and we bought people's mortgages and worked out deals with the borrowers to keep the loans out of foreclosure. So we took situations where if we didn't step in, the bank would have foreclosed on the building and put people out of work. So a large part of that, what I was doing was analyzing buildings and markets and saying, are these viable long-term? Here's a short-term hiccup where money isn't available, and we're gonna step into situations where we think a year from now, when the economy is doing better, that money will flow into these projects again. And we had a great track record of it. A little bit of it was easy because things had gotten so bad, it just took anyone with money. But we identified particularly good situations, and really helped the economy that way. What is different about me and someone like Trump, Trump became a promoter. Trump until 1990 built things himself with his own money, and he borrowed money to get there. And in the early 90s, he went bankrupt in a lot of his projects. And when I started in the business in 1993 as a lender, I was given a list of 10 names of people you couldn't do business with in the country. Name number one at the top was Donald Trump. And my whole career has been about staying away from Trump, to the point that in two different deals that were presented to me that really made sense from every way to look at them, except the owner was Donald Trump. And I said, no, you can't do it. I don't care that Nike is your tenant and Nike is gonna pay on the lease, because if anything goes wrong and you have to deal with Trump, he will screw you, because that's what he's all about. as a lender and as a guy who worked with multiple parties to bring them together, my approach to doing business is both sides are supposed to win. You bring two parties together to a deal, they're both supposed to walk away feeling good about it. Donald Trump's idea of doing business is I take and you give and I win, and that generally means you lose. And no one wants to do business with him a second time. And fortunately, at the end of the day, I think that's what's going to be good for all of us, because the more he's president, the more people don't want to do with it, anything to do with him anymore. His popularity has been falling, and I think will continue to fall, and that's why Zeldin's vulnerable.
That history is a great story, and probably, I think, the public needs to hear more about it. You try to save foreclosures, put people to work, and that's a great story. Now, is there any way you can bring finance jobs to Long Island based upon what you've done, the people you know, and changing workforce where people are working remotely?
People working remotely is a good thing. Bringing finance jobs to Long Island, you need to give. I haven't thought it through that much, so I'm thinking on the fly here. You need to give.
Or attract finance companies to come this way.
That's an easier one for me to answer. It's hard to attract a finance company to move. Finance companies tend to relocate for cheap labor. And that's not what we're gonna do here, and it's not what we wanna do here. Where I think we can really grow our economy is from ideas. And we have great education and research institutions, and good ideas come out of them. So even in a higher cost environment, we can still make it worthwhile for businesses to open around those ideas. That's, I think, the way we develop going forward. We're not gonna bring our costs down enough. We can bring them down a little bit to make business more competitive. But when Grumman came here, it was farm country, and this was a cheap place to do business. We're not gonna duplicate that. We don't wanna duplicate that.
Bernie, oh, sorry, Bernie.
No, I actually had a couple of questions too. You made a comment a few minutes ago about taxes and the middle class and wanting to do things to help the middle class with taxes. So a couple things related to that. I mean, first of all, as you go east from Brookhaven to East Hampton and Amagansett, the diversity in income levels is dramatic. How people define middle class depends upon where you live. You know, you've lived in New York. Middle class in New York is not the same as middle class in the town of Brookhaven. So what do you mean by middle class? Because that the definition has a lot to do with the tax levels.
A middle class to me is a function both of how much income you have and what your expenses are. The middle class in Long Island is 75,000 plus to over 100,000 in some cases. It's a nebulous concept, as you say, and it does move depending on where you are. Middle class in Georgia is a lot less than it's going to be here. And it's also a function of, you have to look at not just how much money you're making, but what your expenses are. Property taxes are much higher here. So to be middle class in a high tax environment, you need to make more money just to start with.
I think there's a lot of people out here who would think $75,000 a year is a lot of money, and it's not middle class. I mean, I'm not trying to pin you down, but I guess I sort of am, because the constituency that you're going to be talking to is all over the map.
Right, no, I agree with that. It is all over the map, and middle class relief is for, it can be a big gap. Middle class can be anywhere from, you can even define middle class as $250,000 and below. I'm trying to think of where you don't want to hurt people. And $250,000 could be a level, and then you start incrementing the taxes and raising the taxes people pay when they have incomes over $250,000. what I wanna be sure of when I say help the middle class is that the tax increases don't hit people. If you don't pick a high enough level, then people aren't gonna vote for you. You're not gonna be able to institute those policies. But there's a lot of room for people in the higher income levels, nationally too. There are also ways you can define it so that property taxes come into the equation, as they should. They used to until this new tax law passed. So high property taxes, if you paid high property taxes, you could deduct it so that your tax levels weren't as high as they would be when you don't deduct it. Now we're limiting the deductions for property tax, so it's harder for someone who used to be middle class or not phrase it, someone who used to not be as impacted by high federal taxes now are gonna pay more because they can't deduct their property and state and local income tax.
Well, if I could just, different subject. I don't know how big your campaign staff is, and at the session in Riverhead 2 days ago, I heard each of the candidates, and you repeated it tonight. The mantra is we have to do anything we can do to get rid of Lee Zeldin. I don't know to what degree your campaign staff is tracking things that Zeldin does publicly and says publicly. There was an editorial that Zeldin wrote in USA Today 2 days ago. Did you see that editorial? I mean, it was just a pack of lies, and I'm wondering to what degree you see yourself visibly, overtly, contesting what Zeldin does. Like as an example, writing a letter to the editor of USA Today saying, "I'm a candidate, for a seat in CD1, and I just want to comment on the things that Lee Zeldin just said because they're all lies."
I've started doing that. I actually posted on my Facebook site this morning a response specifically to the USA Today piece that Zeldin wrote, and I updated it this afternoon. Zeldin sent a letter to the department, to Sessions, signed by basically the Freedom Caucus. Devin Nunes didn't even sign it, demanding a special counsel be appointed to investigate why they ended the Clinton inquiry and started the Russia inquiry. And it's absolute craziness, and we've got to call him out for it. It was Zeldin, Claudia Tenney, and then the Freedom Caucus.
I'm simply suggesting putting it on your Facebook page is fine and dandy. I don't know how many followers you have. I'm talking about doing something that's more publicly visible to the constituency that you're trying to get to vote for you.
I think we need to do that. I think it's a
And I
great
know
idea.
it's
I
early
think it's a great idea. I wish I could tell you I've done that. I'm going to do that.
Okay.
Ask me again in a week, and I think it's a great idea.
I appreciate that, thank you.
Okay, I want to ask about housing. All of the candidates have said at one time or another they want to do affordable housing here in Long Island. But given the fact that A, we have a lack of land, B, the high taxes, C, the high cost of construction, what do you consider affordable housing, and how would you get money to build?
So,
I mean, not your own.
One, just the last part, the federal government can make money available, particularly in partnership with state and county, to build affordable housing. Government has done that in the past, and we should do more of that going forward. And there are departments that, like HUD, that are supposed to be doing that. And we're not doing enough of it right now. So that's the easy answer to the second part of your question. In terms of what affordable housing means, I've thought about this a lot. It's a little bit different in the South Fork, for instance, than it is in Brookhaven. Affordable housing in the South Fork, we have teachers and policemen and firefighters who can't live locally. and we need to find ways to make people, members of the community, able to live in the community. We don't have a real community if people have to drive long distances to become part of the community and then leave it at the end of the night. So that should be the emphasis in the South Fork type area. In Brookhaven, we have a different problem in that we have young people who graduate college and they don't have good housing options and they don't have good employment options. If we had more workforce housing, work to work, walk to work, and housing options that were cheaper, apartment houses, it will change the dynamic and make it easier for businesses to open and make it more likely that young people will stay local. So that's really what I mean about affordable housing on the other side of the canal. And you could look at Patchogue that has done a nice job of providing apartment housing. It's not perfect, and not perfect at all, but at least it's a start. You've got some apartment houses there, and there are other areas of Brookhaven where we could build them and try to at least. I don't think, and then you pointed out some problems. Nothing is easy. You have land use issues, and we don't want to develop our open land. The answer to affordable housing in the South Fork is not to develop the open land, because that's what people like in the South Fork. That's what makes the community beautiful that we have. It's why we live here. So we need to find ways to rehabilitate or take over housing, buy back housing where there's an opportunity. It's not, there's no perfect solution.
But what do you call affordable housing? What kind of number? I mean, like Tritech in the middle of Patchogue has a hard time keeping renters, and the ones that are there, you know, there's like 3-4 roommates shacking up in an apartment because they can't afford it. The turnover is enormous there because of the high rents and also because of the noise being right in the middle of the bar scene. You know, so where would you propose building, and what do you call dollar amount affordable?
Dollar amount affordable is what, in that area certainly, it is what a young person in a job can afford to pay. And I'm not giving you precise numbers.
So sliding.
It's going to be sliding scale,
Sliding
and it's a
scale.
function of what, the whole idea of affordable housing is to provide housing options for people so they can afford to live and work locally.
And would you say the same thing would be applicable like in the South Fork? It seems, because it seems like so many social services and apartments and different projects like that have been focused on being dumped in Patchogue and in Shirley and Mastic and Riverhead, and it's sort of immune, you know, to the East End.
It's different in the East End. There are different political pressures, and I try to think about what you can do. If you can make incremental progress from where you are today, I think you've achieved something. And if you create a problem in a community or a big problem in a community, you're not going to get anything done. So it's a little bit incrementalism. But the driver where I can make a difference as a congressman is providing dollars to the community. And the local and county governments and residents really need to talk more and think about how they can use the federal money best to provide affordable housing, whatever that means to their area.
We have so many questions. We have to be out of here soon, so I'm gonna start with you, and then we'll move our way over to this side of the room.
As a self-described, well-meaning, democratic-leaning, financial business developer, who thinks, you know, you're gonna be an outside candidate, I'm wondering about the responsibilities of a representative to be in charge of legislation, regulations, writing laws, bills, and yet you have no legal training. And you mentioned like Bobby Kennedy and Teddy Kennedy and Harvard Law School and stuff. So what makes you think when you get to the House of Representatives, with your well-meaning, democratic-leaning financial background, that you'll be able to not be outwitted by all of these highly educated lawyers that are also in Congress and House of Representatives?
Well, I'm a reasonably well-educated person. I have an MBA. I graduated from a good college, and I've spent my career, a good part of my career, working with lawyers, managing lawyers, and having the respect of lawyers. One of the reasons that I mentioned lawyers as a big donors group to my campaign, lawyers love working with me because I contribute to the process. There are two ways to run lawyers. One is to go yell at them and go tell them to figure it out, and the other way is to try to work with them and develop creative solutions to problems, and that's what I was known for. So I think actually it translates very well to government experience, particularly when you're talking about the legal side. I'm not a lawyer, but most people who work with me think I'm a lawyer, because that's the way I think.
Well, you won't be talking to your employees, you'll be talking to other legislators, though,
But
when you're in Congress. You can't yell at them or fire them.
I don't do that. I've never done that. My model is I work with people as peers and have a pretty flat work structure. And the best people, and one of the things I'm proudest of my financial career and real estate career, is that the people who worked for me through the years developed into leaders in the field today. When in the 90s, I hired 6 or 7 people out of college who are now fund leaders in the real estate community today. And I was very good at training people and training people's skills to work cooperatively and to educate them together, and they would educate me.
And you'll bring them with you to Washington to help write
We're
legislation?
We're
Not
gonna
at
move
all.
on to Barbara.
Thank you for coming. The thing that I was the most impressed with you at the Southampton Forum and again tonight, you give really thoughtful answers, they have nuance, they are smart, you have a lot of background and education behind them, particularly in the area of the tax bill, which I think Zeldin is very vulnerable on. But he puts out a fog of lies that people then get lost in. And so I guess my question to you is, if you're the nominee, how would you be able to communicate the kind of nuance that I think is your strongest point when we live in a soundbite world, and Zeldin is really skilled at saying nothing and saying it really well?
A large part of that is going to be mine, or whoever the candidate's ability to message and get message out and communication. I've started my campaign by building a team of messaging people. I have a mail firm and a TV firm that are already engaged in the campaign, talking strategy and talking about how we're going to communicate with people both in the primary and then in the general election. We have to raise money. We've done a lot of that. We're going to need to continue to do that, because if we don't have money, we won't be able to get the message out. But I think we're doing a good job of it already. We sent a letter out last week to 4,000 voters. And I couldn't send it to everybody for cost reasons, but we tried to identify prime voters who are likely to vote in the primary and also likely to want to be more involved in petitioning and bring my campaign and my issues to their attention. And that's a start, but I think we're going to do a lot of that. And then attacking Lee Zeldin every way we can, including editorials, which again is a great way to do it. The more stature I get with my name, the more likely newspapers are to print them. And as the Democratic nominee, it'll get easier than as candidate. But even today, more people will listen to Perry Gershon as the guy who's raised $1 million for the campaign than Perry Gershon, the guy who says he's gonna raise a lot of money for the campaign.
You do a very good job of, anytime something happens in the news, you're there with an email to say, here's how I feel about it. Barbara. I'm sorry, Wendy.
Another major aspect of this is actually getting people to vote. And one of the problems here is younger voters. Always has been. I think 7% or something voted in the last midterm election of those between 18 and 29. Now, you said you have 2 sons who are in that age. So do you have any insight? Do you have, as to how you'll attract that age group, or are you going to concentrate? Are you planning on concentrating on any get out the vote in certain areas, such as with younger voters or with minorities or Native Americans, because we have the Shinnecock and the Poospatuck couple of reservations? So do you have any plans to target get out the vote?
The biggest target right now along those lines is the University Center. We opened our campaign office last week in Setauket, right outside of Stony Brook. Very high profile, and we are targeting that area. I make no bones about it. That's where the more Democrats in that area than anywhere else in the district. And if we're gonna win this election, I don't mean the primary, I mean the general, we need those people to vote in huge turnout.
And you have Suffolk Community College down the street too.
Mm-hmm. All of that area, that's where the Democrats are, and if we move the needle more in that area, it will have a bigger impact. It would be great, and I'd like to target the minority vote as well. I mean, if you look at the Latino vote, they should be voting Democratic at some astronomical level, but they're also afraid of what's going on here. And until you make things better, it's hard to give them the confidence to vote. So I do want them to vote more than anything. So I don't want this to come out the wrong way. But if you're gonna count on a group that you can really move the needle on, I think it's the young people around the universities. And my messaging is about creating jobs for younger people too. And hopefully that encourages people to wanna vote.
Sima?
Perry, several times when I've mentioned your name to people in the movement, you've been dismissed. Oh, he's that guy from New York. How do you deal with that? I mean, it's real, and it's a very real concern, because you started out today saying what counts more than anything else is the electability of the candidate. And that's a problem for you.
What I've found from my experience, and not everybody's gonna agree with this, is that I have that problem less in Brookhaven than I do out on the East End. I think there was, what happened in the last election was disappointing. There was a lot of bad blood after the primary. And Anna won against Dave Colon, who was a favored son of Brookhaven. And people perceived of Brookhaven's rejection of Anna as rejection of class and elitism. And even last night I was out with people in the Three Village Democratic Club and talking to them about that. And they laughed when I said it, because they know me, they talk to me, and I don't come across, to them at least, as elitist at all. But Anna did. So it's a difference in perception, and I need to communicate with people and get them to know me. And hopefully that will get the message across.
There's only one of you, and you have, as you told me the other day, you spend half your life in the car driving. And you know, physically, that's a real problem. When you have a 10-hour day, let's say you're working, and you spent 3 of it or 4 of it just getting places. is there some way that you can deal with that? Maybe in an apartment by your office?
I honestly, I'm looking at that, I could show you the email.
We'll fill in the back row there.
First of all, kudos to you for bringing your own water bottle. Too many people drink out of plastic water bottles. I want to follow up on a question here about affordable housing and the middle class. You mentioned 250,000 is maybe the top of the middle class. What do you consider to be the bottom of the middle class? So I work in the restaurant industry, and there are a lot of waiters, bartenders who live out here and try and get housing out here, and they're making $30,000 to $50,000 a year. Do you consider that middle class, or do you consider that less than middle class?
It depends, it could be middle class. A middle class is an interesting term, because if you poll Americans and say, are you middle class? A huge number, 75% will say yes.
I'm
People
not asking
like,
what they think, I'm asking what you
Long
think.
Island.
What do you think the dollar ratio is for the middle class? You mentioned 250,000 as a top. What do you think is the bottom of the middle class before it gets into lower middle class and poverty?
30,000, but again, it depends on where you are. Even within Long Island, it depends on where you are and how big the family unit is. It's a family of 4 is different than a family of 1. So it's a little bit dependent. I'm trying to think of, it also depends on how you're applying middle class. I mean, who is middle class is to an extent people who identify themselves that way.
That's not the point I'm trying to make. When you talk about affordable housing for middle class people, there's a huge difference
Now I understand
between
the question.
affordable housing for $250,000 a year and $30,000 a year.
I'm not talking about affordable housing for people at $250,000 a year. At $250,000 a year, I'm thinking about where you don't want to increase taxes. I don't want to increase the tax burden on someone who's making $225,000 a year. But someone who's making $500,000 a year, they probably should be paying more taxes. That's where I was drawing that line. For affordable housing, I'm on the way on the other side of that. 30 to 60,000 would probably be my range.
Mary?
To expand a little bit on what Sima said, I'm really concerned that people are gonna label you a carpetbagger and just say, you know, Zeldin can use that against you. How would you fight that in a debate? If he threw that in your face, how are you gonna fight that in a debate?
I would start by saying I've lived in East Hampton for 22 years. I've paid taxes in East Hampton for 22 years. And if that doesn't make me a resident of East Hampton for 22 years, I don't know what does. Now, let's talk about real issues. Let's talk about jobs. Let's talk about housing. Let's talk about healthcare. And actually, let's talk about healthcare. We haven't talked about that yet.
That's the
gonna,
perfect answer. I mean, I just think that that's gonna be thrown in your face.
I was gonna give you an
Can I get a question
opportunity.
on healthcare?
Sure, yeah, I mean, unless anybody has a specific question on healthcare, I was gonna throw it back to you before we ended to talk about anything that we missed. So let's get a few more questions and then you can talk about healthcare.
Hi, I have just a simple image question, that there are some people that know nothing about Zeldin. They just see the name, they see a military guy, a family man, and they vote for him. How do you combat that?
So, Zeldin ran the first time as a guy who wasn't in government, wasn't in Congress, and said, I'm a vet, vote for a vet, we need to respect our vets, we need to take care of our vets, and sounded like a good thing to veterans. He ran a second time after being in office, but with a Democratic president, and any issues that vets might have with what he had accomplished, you could write off to, well, there was Obama was the president, and he wasn't responsible for what he accomplished. Well, now he's had 2 years under Donald Trump, and what has he done for vets? And when I say for vets, I don't mean for spending money on the military, I mean for spending money on vets when they return home. Zeldin's record on the VA is terrible, and we need to go after him, and he's very vulnerable on it. It's a myth that Zeldin is walking on this sainthood like land because he's a vet. It sounded good before, but now he's had 4 years in office, and what has he done for people? And I can point,
And
he
that's
wants to
important.
privatize the VA. Think about what that's really gonna do to you. And if you're a vet, do you want that? So I think that's where we go after him.
I love when you talk about Zeldin. Anybody else?
I'm sorry. Don't you think you can paint him as ineffective? Look, he passed that stupid tax law, which is some Midwestern Republican's fever dream, where they don't have high taxes. That passed under his watch. They want to drill for oil anywhere, offshore Long Island. And they want to deport our workforce. I'm sorry, all right, the subtext is, immigrants. Oh, and so he's passing some stupid law where, he's going to deport the criminals. Oh, good for you. That'll get him a lot of votes and, on people, the worst ranges of people's natures he'll apply to. But the guy's ineffective. And don't you think you can just cut through the fog and paint, and paint that?
I think you paint him, he's wrong on the environment.
Yeah.
He's wrong on healthcare. He tried to take away people's healthcare. He's wrong on taxes, which you talked about. He's wrong on choice. He's wrong on consumer protections. His votes are always against, it's pro-bank. It's all of the regulation that was put in place after 2008. He's trying to take that away. So he's vulnerable there. But the biggest one that we see today is guns and concealed carry reciprocity. He's for something that Peter King is against. He's so pro-NRA. He gets more money than anyone in New York, in the New York Congressional delegation, from the NRA. His reaction to the Parkland shooting is, we need more mental health legislation. And we need to have better controls over people. And he's attacked the local police department for not taking better action. He's so tainted, and that's where we attack him. We show him for what he is, and will be, have been, and will continue to be all about that. And that's a large part of my campaign.
Subscribe to Perry's emails.
Please sign up. I'll make the pitch. Please sign up for my email list. You will like them if you don't like Zeldin.
So I'll throw it back to you now. What have we missed? What do you want to end on?
Two things. We didn't talk about healthcare, which I think is an important issue in the election. I am for universal healthcare. It's one of the reasons that I'm running, and I think it's a front and center issue for Democrats. I'm for single-payer healthcare. I think that's the right solution going forward. I'm not a crash and burn to get there. I think we've made major improvements from before President Obama got elected to where we are today. 23 million Americans have health care coverage who didn't have it before, and we need to make sure they keep it as we get closer and closer to single payer. Single payer is Medicare for all, is better because it takes the burden for paying for health care off the employer. That means everyone has insurance. It means people can leave their jobs and not worry about losing their insurance. And it means small businesses can start up and worry about their business issues and not have to worry about providing health insurance. And oh, by the way, it costs a small business, a startup business, more money per employee to provide that health care insurance than a big business pays. So we're taxing our small businesses because of the way the healthcare system is structured. We need to change that, but healthcare is a right. We need to change it, not by taking away coverage, but by moving it to the government.
Also, with property taxes, I was on a school board, and a big chunk of a school budget is healthcare benefits for their employees and retirees. So if we had universal healthcare, it's a very important point that it will lower your school taxes because it will take a big portion out of the budget that we have to pay for every year. Every single school district on Long Island pays.
And we'll lower property taxes as a
Exactly,
result.
because the school taxes are
right.
the largest
Right.
portion of a local property tax. So it's an important element to remember on that.
And that's where the progressive income tax comes into play again. We're supposed to be paying for the health care with the progressive tax. The people who can afford to pay into the system should be the ones paying. So,
Sure.
Perry, how do people sign up for your emails? Tell them where they would go, do they?
we have a list there, or you can go to my website, which is easy, perrygershon.com, and there's a sign up button on it. Just to conclude,
Sure, please.
I went through a lot of this already. I think Lee Zeldin is very vulnerable. He's moved to the right from where he was when he ran before. And we can and must label him for what he is. We should pay attention to where he is on guns, where he is on the Mueller investigation. He's aligned himself with Jim Jordan and the crazies of the Republican caucus, the Freedom Caucus now. And it almost feels like every day he goes one step further that way. He did a fundraiser with Steve Bannon in December. He's doing nothing to moderate himself. And that creates an opening for us as Democrats to form a Tim Bishop-like coalition of progressive Democrats and people who just don't like what's going on in this country, who may be Republican and maybe they'll vote Republican in the next election, but want to change right now. And that's how we're going to win this election.
That's great. Thank you so much. We have about 15, 20 minutes before the library closes, so if anybody would like to talk to Perry one-on-one, I encourage you to do that. And thank you for coming. Thank you so much. That was great.
Thank you. Sorry I brought you out of order.
No, I know. I had my card right there.
We have to get a picture.
Oh, that's right. Yes, let's get a picture before we leave. I know. Oh, my trip was great. It was great. It was.
All right, Kyle. Good seeing you. I'll talk
First,
to you
I was
soon.
in Pennsylvania. He's 90, she's 90. I'm not 80.
We had a great time, yeah, but it was too short. And this would go only goes too long. But it was great. I know, I'm trying to, this week, trying to sort of get back in the swing of everything.
That's a tough
Get a picture of you.
Sima. Everybody has Sima. Eastern Action Network.
Yeah, Eastern Action Network.
See if she's gonna reach out to the other.